Now, new information has been confirmed regarding forensic evidence collected from her home, specifically hair samples. These samples were initially sent to DNA Labs International, a private forensic laboratory in Florida that the Pima County Sheriff's Office regularly contracts for DNA analysis. But those same hair samples have now been sent to the FBI laboratory. This is where the timeline becomes significant. According to a public statement released by the FBI, and it's worth noting that the FBI rarely issues public statements that criticize partner agencies, they requested this hair evidence approximately 60 days into the investigation. That request was not fulfilled. The evidence was sent to the Florida lab instead. Only now, at day 86, has it been transferred to the FBI. The FBI's statement was direct. Quote, FBI asked to test this DNA 2 months ago with the same technology we've always had when the local sheriff instead sent it to a private lab. This is not standard procedural language. This is public criticism. For the FBI to release a statement like this indicates significant frustration with how evidence has been handled. It also raises an immediate investigative question. What justification exists for a 2-month delay in following federal recommendations on forensic evidence? The Pima County Sheriff's Department responded with their own statement, emphasizing that they've worked with the FBI since the beginning and that the Florida lab continues to share information with the FBI and other partner labs across the country. They confirmed that DNA analysis remains ongoing. But sharing information is not the same as sending physical evidence, and ongoing analysis does not explain why a specific FBI request went unfulfilled for 2 months in an active kidnapping investigation. To understand why this matters, we need to examine what makes hair evidence valuable and what makes it challenging. Hair found at a crime scene, or in this case inside a victim's home, falls into 2 categories: hair with the root attached and hair without the root, often called rootless hair or hair shaft. If the hair has a root, DNA extraction is straightforward. The root contains nuclear DNA, which provides the kind of individual identification used in criminal databases like CODIS, the Combined DNA Index System. A profile from rooted hair can be run through CODIS immediately. If there's a match to someone in the system, you potentially have your suspect within hours. But if the hair is rootless, the process is entirely different. For years, rootless hair was considered forensically limited. You could extract mitochondrial DNA, which is passed down through the maternal line, but mitochondrial DNA is shared by thousands of people. It can rule people out, but it can't positively identify an individual. That limitation has changed. In the last few years, laboratories like Othram Forensics and researchers at UC Santa Cruz, particularly Dr. Ed Green and his team, have developed methods to extract what are called SNPs, single nucleotide polymorphisms, from rootless hair. These are genetic markers that make each person unique. With enough SNPs, you can build a DNA profile suitable for genetic genealogy. Genetic genealogy is the process that has solved cold cases like the Golden State Killer and, more recently, contributed to the identification of Rex Heuermann in the Gilgo Beach murders. It involves uploading a DNA profile to genealogical databases, finding distant relatives who share DNA with the unknown individual, and reverse engineering a family tree to identify the suspect. The FBI has utilized this technology. They've worked with specialized contractors who perform SNP extraction from rootless hair. The fact that this hair evidence is now going to the FBI suggests that investigators believe it may be rootless hair, because if it had a root attached, the Florida lab would have already processed it using standard STR analysis. This raises another critical question. Whose hair is it? Nancy Guthrie lived in that home. Her family visited. Service workers, friends, delivery personnel, people come and go from any residence. Hair is transferred constantly. It falls naturally, it's carried on clothing, it's left on furniture and floors. So the presence of hair inside her home does not automatically mean it belongs to her kidnapper. It could belong to Nancy herself. It could belong to a family member, a neighbor, a contractor. The forensic value depends entirely on whose hair it is and where it was found. This is not a guaranteed breakthrough. This is, in investigative terms, a calculated risk. The hope is that the DNA profile extracted from this hair will not match Nancy, will not match any known visitor to her home, and will instead point to an unknown individual who had no legitimate reason to be there. If that happens, and if SNP extraction is successful, investigators can begin the genetic genealogy process. But that process takes months. It requires identifying DNA matches in genealogical databases, building family trees for those matches, finding common ancestors, and narrowing down potential suspects through genealogical research. There is no fast resolution here. Even under ideal circumstances, this is a 6 to 12-month investigative pathway. And success is not guaranteed. Some hair samples contain more DNA than others. Chemical treatments like hair dye can interfere with extraction. Environmental degradation can render samples unusable. The FBI knows this. They requested this evidence 2 months ago because they understood the timeline. Every day of delay extends the overall investigation. If the hair extraction fails, or if the profile matches an innocent source, investigators will have lost 2 additional months that could have been spent pursuing alternative evidence. Which brings us to a more uncomfortable question. Why was the delay allowed to happen? Public records obtained through a Freedom of Information Act request reveal something that was not widely known at the time of Nancy's disappearance. In the months leading up to this case, the Pima County Sheriff's Department underwent what were described as rotational reassignments in key investigative positions. Specifically, the heads of the homicide unit and the cold case unit were moved out of their leadership roles. These were experienced investigators. According to sources familiar with the department's internal dynamics, these moves were not based on performance. They were political. The individuals who were reassigned had not supported the current sheriff during his election campaign. The supervisor overseeing the Nancy Guthrie investigation had never previously led a homicide case. This is not speculation. This was confirmed by a key investigative source who spoke with NewsNation reporter Brian Enton. Retired FBI Supervisory Special Agent Steve Moore, who spent decades investigating kidnappings and violent crimes, was asked directly whether this concerned him. His response was measured but clear. "We'd be in a different place. I can't say for sure that it would have been solved. I'll bet we would have been way farther down the road and possibly solved." That assessment is based on investigative reality. The first 72 hours of a kidnapping investigation are critical. Decisions made in those initial hours, what evidence is prioritized, what resources are requested, which forensic pathways are pursued, those decisions shape the entire trajectory of the case. If experienced leadership had been in place, would the hair evidence have gone directly to the FBI when they requested it 60 days in? Would additional evidence have been collected before the crime scene was released? Would the relationship with federal partners have been managed differently? These are not rhetorical questions. They have investigative consequences. The hair evidence is not the only forensic challenge in this case. The Pima County Sheriff's Department has also referenced mixed DNA samples recovered from Nancy's home. Mixed DNA means genetic material from multiple individuals is present in a single sample. This is common in residential environments. A door handle, a light switch, bedding, these surfaces accumulate DNA from everyone who touches them. Separating out individual profiles from a mixed sample is complex. It requires probabilistic genotyping software and significant lab expertise. DNA Labs International has the capability to perform this kind of analysis, but it takes time. The more contributors in a sample, the harder it becomes to isolate one individual's profile, particularly if that person's DNA is present in a smaller quantity than others. The key difference between the mixed DNA and the hair evidence is this. Hair from a single individual, even without a root, is a single-source sample. It may be contaminated on the outside, but laboratories can clean external contamination. What remains is DNA from one person. That makes it simpler to analyze than mixed DNA. It also makes it potentially more valuable if it belongs to the right person. From the beginning, there has been debate about whether Nancy was taken by one person or multiple individuals. The doorbell camera shows one figure. But the logistics of the crime suggest complications. Controlling an adult victim, moving them from a home to a vehicle, maintaining control over them for any length of time. These are not simple tasks for a single individual. Statistically, ransom kidnappings often involve multiple conspirators: someone to control the victim, someone to manage communication, someone to handle logistics. But statistics are not evidence. There have been solo kidnappings. They tend to involve child victims or situations where the perpetrator has a significant physical advantage and a controlled environment. Steve Moore addressed this question directly. When asked whether he believed this was one person or multiple suspects, his answer was careful. "I think both are possible. I think it's more likely statistically that it was two people." He went on to explain the practical challenges. You can't live your normal life if you have a guest who's trying to escape. It's undoable with one person for any length of time. But he also noted that in kidnapping cases he's worked, when multiple people are involved, the conspiracy rarely holds. Quote, "Everybody has a risk tolerance. In that situation, one of the two will have a risk tolerance that is not as high as the partner, which means they will bail before the other one will. In other words, if two or more people were involved, the likelihood increases that one of them will eventually talk. Fear, guilt, self-preservation. These pressures fracture conspiracies. So far, that hasn't happened. No one has come forward. No accomplice has turned. Which means either this was a solo operation or the individuals involved have maintained operational security for nearly 3 months. Both scenarios remain possible. Neither has been confirmed. The ransom element of this case introduces another investigative layer. The initial notes were assessed as genuine. This was not a false flag. Someone took Nancy and demanded payment. But then communication stopped. No proof of life was ever provided. According to investigative protocol, neither the family nor the FBI would authorize ransom payment without proof that Nancy was alive. This is standard practice. It prevents paying for a victim who is already deceased, and it maintains leverage in negotiations. The silence that followed suggests something went wrong. Steve Moore's interpretation is direct. This was an amateur kidnapping that went bad. They broke the first rule of getting a ransom, and that's losing what you have to bargain with. If Nancy was harmed or killed before proof of life could be established, the kidnappers would have found themselves in an impossible position. They couldn't provide proof of life. They couldn't get paid. They couldn't release a witness. They couldn't continue communication without increasing their risk of identification. So they went silent. This interpretation is not confirmed. But it aligns with the evidence. Genuine ransom intent, followed by complete cessation of contact. It also suggests a grim reality, that Nancy was likely harmed early in the sequence of events, possibly within the first days or weeks. If that's accurate, this is no longer a rescue operation. This is a recovery and identification operation. The goal is not to negotiate Nancy's release. The goal is to identify who took her, locate her remains, and build a prosecutable case. There are investigative elements that remain unclear. For instance, vehicle identification. Early in the investigation, the sheriff's department referenced surveillance footage of a white SUV in the area. But no public appeal was made for information about that vehicle. No description was released, no request for witnesses who may have seen it. This is unusual. In high-profile cases, vehicle identification often becomes a central investigative focus. In the University of Idaho murders, the white Hyundai Elantra became a critical break in the case. Public attention on that vehicle led to tips that helped narrow the suspect pool. When asked why no vehicle description has been released in the Nancy Guthrie case, Steve Moore offered two possibilities. Either investigators have not been able to identify it conclusively, or they have identified it and are withholding that information for investigative reasons. The FBI, he explained, does not release information unless it serves an investigative purpose. Quote, "We have public trials. We don't have public investigations. This creates a gap between what the public knows and what investigators know. That gap can be frustrating, but it's also intentional. Evidence disclosed prematurely can compromise prosecution. It can alert suspects. It can contaminate witness statements. So the absence of a public vehicle description does not necessarily mean investigators don't have one. It may mean they've chosen not to release it. The same logic applies to other evidence. The content of the ransom notes has not been disclosed. The specific location where the hair was found has not been specified. The results of DNA testing on other items collected from the home have not been announced. Steve Moore was asked directly, "Do you think there's significant information the FBI knows that the public doesn't?" His response, "If you could go in and get briefed by 4 or 5 different agents working it, you would find so much information that ultimately turned out to be of little or no value, but seemed so promising at the time." In other words, investigations generate massive amounts of information. Most of it leads nowhere. Some of it seems critical at first, then becomes irrelevant. A small fraction of it becomes the foundation of a case. The public doesn't see that process. The public sees announcements, press conferences, updates. What they don't see is the volume of dead ends, false leads, and inconclusive evidence that investigators work through. One additional element deserves examination. Approximately 1 month ago, a volunteer organization called EquiSearch submitted a detailed plan to the Pima County Sheriff's Department offering to conduct ground searches for Nancy. EquiSearch is a nonprofit search and rescue organization with experience in missing person cases. They have drones, search dogs, trained personnel. Their proposal was specific. They requested guidance from the Sheriff's Department on where to search. They asked for approval and coordination so they wouldn't interfere with the investigation. They made clear they wanted to work under the direction of law enforcement, not independently. The Sheriff's Department did not respond. The offer was ignored. EquiSearch subsequently submitted a revised plan, again requesting feedback and cooperation. Again, no response. Steve Moore was asked whether this made sense from an investigative standpoint. His answer was blunt. "Why not? What are we losing here? You already released the crime scene too early. Now you're afraid they're going to trample on your crime scene again?" He went on. "If somebody could come up and say, 'This is the reason we don't want to do this,' that would be cool. But not responding to them is counterproductive and disrespectful." It's worth noting that volunteer searches can yield results even in cases where the primary target is not found. Desert environments often contain evidence from multiple unsolved cases. Aircraft wreckage, human remains, personal effects. These things surface during organized searches. But the offer remains unacknowledged. At this stage, we need to be clear about what is known and what remains uncertain. What is confirmed? Nancy Guthrie was taken from her home on February 24, 2025. Ransom notes were received and assessed as genuine. Communication ceased without proof of life. STR. Hair evidence collected from her home has now been sent to the FBI for advanced DNA analysis after a 2-month delay. The FBI publicly criticized that delay. Mixed DNA samples from the home are still being analyzed. The supervisor overseeing the case had no prior homicide investigative experience. Experienced leaders in homicide and cold case units were reassigned for reportedly political reasons. The case remains unsolved. What is interpreted but not confirmed? The hair is likely rootless, which is why it requires advanced SNP extraction rather than standard DNA testing. The kidnapping was likely carried out by amateurs who lost control of the situation. Nancy was likely harmed early, possibly within days or weeks, which explains the lack of proof of life and cessation of communication. Multiple suspects are statistically more likely than a solo perpetrator, but evidence of only one individual has been made public. What remains unknown? Whose hair was found and where it was located? Whether DNA extraction will be successful? Whether the DNA will match an unknown individual or an innocent source? What other evidence has been collected and analyzed? Whether a vehicle has been identified? What the ransom notes contained? What investigative leads are being actively pursued? The timeline ahead is measured in months, not days. SNP extraction from rootless hair is not a quick process. Even if successful, genetic genealogy can take 6 months or longer. And success is not guaranteed. There's one more element that deserves scrutiny. In the months before Nancy disappeared, the Pima County Sheriff's Department was working with A&E Network on a reality television series. The show was planned to follow deputies on calls, document daily operations, and provide behind-the-scenes access to the department. Hundreds of emails between Sheriff's Office personnel and the show's producers have been obtained through public records requests. Those emails show significant time and resources being devoted to planning the show, coordinating access, and providing footage. In one email, producers were told that interviews with the heads of certain units were delayed because the department has experienced some rotational reassignments since last year. This was the first public indication that leadership changes had occurred in homicide and cold case units. When asked about the appropriateness of a sheriff's office devoting resources to a reality show while managing active investigations, Steve Moore's response reflected a tension many in law enforcement feel about these programs. "I think there's positives and negatives," he said. "It gives people an idea what law enforcement is really like. But I can tell you that the agents I spoke with during my career said they wouldn't want anything to do with anything like that because if something goes bad, you've done it on public record right then and there." He also noted something more pointed. When the sheriff is down into the weeds of a case so far that he is making decisions on whether we're going to cooperate with the FBI or not on this one little hair, imagine what else he might have his fingers on. That observation cuts to the core of the issue. Elected sheriffs face political pressures that appointed or career law enforcement officials do not. Media visibility, public perception, control over messaging, these become factors in decision-making. If those factors influenced how evidence was handled, how federal partnerships were managed, or how resources were allocated, then the investigation itself may have been compromised not by lack of capability, but by institutional dysfunction. Nancy Guthrie disappeared 86 days ago. Hair evidence that may help identify her kidnapper is now at the FBI laboratory, 2 months later than it should have been. DNA analysis is ongoing, but results are months away. The case remains unsolved. What we're looking at is not a mystery. This is not a case where the evidence is absent or the trail is cold. This is a case where evidence exists, but extracting usable information from that evidence is procedurally complex and institutionally complicated. If the hair yields a viable DNA profile, and if that profile leads to an unknown individual, genetic genealogy may identify a suspect. But that process is long, uncertain, and dependent on databases that are not comprehensive. Not everyone's relatives have submitted DNA to genealogical services. If the hair does not yield results, investigators will return to the mixed DNA samples, which present their own challenges. And if those samples do not produce a suspect, the case may depend on witness tips, financial forensics, digital evidence, or investigative breakthroughs that have not yet been disclosed. There is also the possibility, remote but real, that someone involved will talk. If this was a multi-person operation, conspiracies break. Fear and guilt erode silence. One conversation with the wrong person, one moment of conscience, one perceived betrayal, and the entire structure collapses. But nearly 3 months have passed and that hasn't happened. So we're left with forensic science and investigative persistence. The FBI is working this case. They have resources, experience, and technology. But they are also working within constraints created by decisions made in the first days and weeks of the investigation, decisions they did not control. Nancy Guthrie's family is waiting. They have been waiting for 86 days. They will likely be waiting for many more. That is the reality of complex forensic investigations. Progress is measured in months. Breakthroughs are uncertain. Resolution is not guaranteed. But cases do get solved. Genetic genealogy has closed investigations that were dormant for decades. Rootless hair technology has identified perpetrators in cases where no other evidence existed. Institutional failures can be overcome by investigative competence and technological advancement. The question is whether that will happen here, and the answer is, we don't know yet. This is an ongoing investigation. Updates will be provided as confirmed information becomes available. If you want to follow this case as developments occur, subscribe to Crime Files. This is where we analyze the evidence, not the speculation. And if you have any information about Nancy Guthrie's disappearance, contact the Pima County Sheriff's Department or the FBI. Sometimes the smallest detail, something that seems irrelevant to you, is exactly what investigators need. This case is not over. But it is also not resolved. And until it is, the only responsible approach is to separate what we know from what we believe, and what we believe from what we hope. Nancy Guthrie deserves answers. Her family deserves resolution. And the investigation, despite its complications, continues.